Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this live stream. Welcome to another iteration of the Psychedelic States of America Psychedelic Advocacy Spotlight Initiative, founded by Jack Gorsline and brought to you by Psychedelics Today and Lucid News. My name is Dr. Elena Jaster. I'm a neuropharmacologist that sometimes studies psychedelics. I'm also a science and medical communicator through this venture with Jack and also through my own podcast, Psychedelic Brain Science. And I'm a great advocate for drug policy reform through Students Responsible Drug Policy. And today I'm really excited and thrilled to be joined by Dr. Jessica Nielsen, founder and current director of Psychedelic Society of Minnesota. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to meet you finally.
Yes, I know we've been interacting online here and there, so happy to actually be on this platform today. So I want to just kind of get right into it and learn a little bit about you and about the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota. So can you tell everybody when and why you first became interested in psychedelics and how kind of going from academic research to founding the Psychedelic Society?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I've been interested in psychedelics for a very long time. I first did LSD when I was 15. Wasn't quite the profound experiences that I've had as an adult, but it kind of got me kind of into that space and was a psychonaut first and foremost before kind of venturing into the research realm or the community realm. But I did get my PhD in neuroscience and was really interested in studying neuroplasticity and things like trauma, while also kind of exploring my own personal practice with psychedelics. And in 2008, I was going to Burning Man. I'd been going to Burning Man for a long time and was there kind of watching various people talking about how they're doing psychedelic research in academic settings. And I was in the middle of my PhD program at the time and thought, okay, maybe I can figure out how to do this professionally, try to get a postdoc going. So I did my postdoctoral training at UCSF, doing more kind of neuroscience and trauma research while also trying to get a project up and running with MAPS to look at ayahuasca for post-traumatic stress disorder. So I started doing some survey research with them to get more data on how folks with PTSD were responding to things like ayahuasca. And then I got recruited to the University of Minnesota in 2017 for a tenure track position in the psychiatry department, where I actually was able to launch a psilocybin clinical trial, which was more of a mechanistic study to look at some neuroplasticity measures using neuroimaging. And at the same time, when I moved to Minnesota, because I was living in San Francisco before I moved to Minnesota, and I was part of the Psychedelic Society there. And so when I moved to Minnesota, I didn't really know anyone or have community. So I was looking around on Meetup for other like-minded folks and didn't see an obvious psychedelic community in Minnesota. And so there was this kind of thing on Meetup that was like, if you don't see your community, create your own. So I just started a new Meetup page in like February of 2018. By April, we had our first meeting. There was about 50 people, one of which was Dennis McKenna. So he was a longtime resident of Minnesota, an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota. And I'd known him for a pretty long time through kind of the ayahuasca research scene and presenting at the MAPS conferences over the years. So it was really helpful to have him there because it really drew people in and people were like, oh, wow, Dennis McKenna's here. And so I think that really kind of helped us launch and get the word out. And so I would say that, I started off as a psychonaut. I've been doing psychedelic research, but I think I founded the community before I actually started the formal clinical trial that I did at the University of Minnesota, really because it was wanting to make friends while also realizing that I wanted to see if there was a viable research population that I could recruit for clinical trials and things like that, while also trying to, advocate for changing laws, because ultimately I want to be able to do psychedelics. I want my friends to be able to do psychedelics. I want to be able to research them scientifically without the government always getting in the way. So it's kind of this multi-pronged approach of community research, advocacy, policy, trying to figure out how can we move the needle through different kind of lenses, because I don't think any one sector really is going to be able to do it. So really trying to kind of take that multidisciplinary approach, but first and foremost being interested in psychedelics personally.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think we're going to get into that with our conversation today of just the different prongs and how, they all kind of fit together to further access to psychedelics, right? So, and yeah, I love the community that you've built. And when we think of the Midwest and of Minnesota, you don't really think psychedelics, right? So were you surprised at the large turnout?
Yes and no. I think, I didn't really understand Minnesota culture when I moved here. And I think people are pretty, like, there's this term Minnesota nice, which is, really kind of just trying to like keep the peace, like being kind to other people, but not rocking the boat too much, not doing anything too controversial. So I think there was a lot of people that were doing them or had done them like back in the early days or in college, but they didn't have people they felt safe that they could talk to about it because they just weren't sure if that would upset somebody. So at the first meeting, that was really the kind of consistent message was like, I love psychedelics, but I don't even know if I can talk to my wife about it. I don't know if I can talk to my colleagues about it, So it was really kind of this very secretive thing but I feel like the community is there. They just needed a place to gather and talk about
Yeah,
it.
and I love it. Okay, so let's kind of talk about your interests in the policy work. So you mentioned, it comes from a place of wanting access for everybody. You want people to be able to do psychedelics. So, um, what are some of the major efforts that you've been leading through Psychedelic Society? Do you want to talk maybe about the mission of the society first before we get into the details?
Yeah. I mean, the overall mission of the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota is really about building community around psychedelics, as well as education and harm reduction. And more recently, really trying to get more into the like research space, because since I left my position at the University of Minnesota, been really trying to, because like as a 501c3 nonprofit, we do have the ability to do anything like an academic institution would do in terms of securing federal funding and running trials and things like that. So really trying to focus the efforts more towards moving towards a research organization. But, our main mission is really about like education and making sure people have the right information so they can engage with psychedelics responsibly, but also being very careful around like the legality of it, and like in the early days of trying to promote events around psychedelics, even just that word would get an event banned or we couldn't advertise for it. So really making sure that we have disclaimers everywhere that everything is like not medical or legal advice. We're not condoning illegal behavior. We're not telling people how to source psychedelics. We're not telling people where to find them or who's administering them in underground settings, and really just trying to keep everything above board, not only to like keep people safe and informed of what they can actually do, but also to make sure that, we're not doing anything illegal, but also keeping ourselves like above ground as like a reputable organization that's really trying to push this through in the kind of right way that the government's comfortable with, so we can be seen as somebody that can advocate on behalf of the community from a place of like legitimacy.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, what are some of the efforts that you guys have been focused on in Minnesota?
Yeah, so the first thing was really just bringing community together, and then in 2020, I guess in 2019, when we saw that Oakland deprioritized or decriminalized entheogens, we started talking to members of City Council in Minneapolis, really trying to figure out if we could get that done here. And we were slated to have like a unanimous City Council vote in Minneapolis in 2020, in like April 2020, but then COVID hit, and so they were like, we need to put a pause on this. This is not at all a priority for us in our discussions of what policies we want to implement in the city. And then George Floyd was murdered. And then so like everything just kind of, blew up. And so it kind of took a back seat. And then there was something that happened in 2023 where the city of Minneapolis changed some of their laws around like who has ultimate authority to make policy decisions. Because before it was like if the city council were to approve some resolution, the mayor could veto it, and then the city council could override the veto. And so they changed that where then like the mayor could just make unilateral executive decisions and the city council couldn't overturn it. So we're like, okay, maybe we should just go straight to the mayor on this and see what we can do. So we had a meeting with the mayor. Within 5 minutes, he was like, you don't need to convince me. I think this is like a non-issue. I'm fine like doing something that would make it so that we don't have to like go out of our way to enforce this. Because basically what they did was, they got sign off from the city attorney and the chief of police, as well as the mayor, to deprioritize the enforcement of, going after people for entheogens, and just recognizing like they weren't even doing that in the first place. So it really wasn't like a big lift for them to do it. And there wasn't really any like opposition about it. So that was pretty easy. And it was just like a piece of paper that was signed, like an executive order that just said, no more going after this. Like it doesn't make it so that people aren't going to get cited or get arrested for having psychedelics, but that can't be the primary reason for an arrest or a search. But a lot of times, like if they're responding to like a domestic violence thing or some other kind of criminal activity, they'll still be able to cite people for having drugs in their possession, but they can't make that the like main reason. So that was sort of the first step. And as that was happening at the same time in 2023, some other folks had helped to lobby a bill through the Minnesota legislature to create this psychedelic medicine task force. And so what that did was create this like psychedelic medicine group of people that was like 22 different members, half appointed directly by the state. So people from like state agencies like the Department of Health, the Department of Public Safety, which is basically the cops, the Attorney General's office, someone from the governor's office, people from each branch of the legislature. So 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate. And then people from the public. So that included myself as sort of like the psychedelic medicine person, because I had been doing clinical trials with psilocybin, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, an addiction medicine specialist, 2 different veterans, 2 patients with treatment-resistant mental health conditions, and then 2 representatives from the tribes that we have in the state, because we have 11 tribes. And so that passed at the end of the 2023 legislative session. All the appointments, except for the tribal representations, were made by the time we had our first meeting, and then we met for 14 months to kind of talk about what would a psychedelic medicine program look like in Minnesota. And by January 2025, we published our kind of 200-page legislative report, which was, a comprehensive review of what's going on in the space, what's happening in other states, what are the legal implications around federal law versus state law, and then what are some recommendations that we could put forth that could potentially be turned into like policies or new laws enacted in the state. And then other efforts that I've been undertaking is really like trying to get the research going through the university, because there wasn't any psychedelic research happening at the University of Minnesota. So it took a very long time to get that research up and running. It was very hard. It was a lot of red tape. The university did not make it easy. The regulatory agencies did not make it easy. But I eventually got it approved, and then more and more people started to be interested in it. Like I started getting asked to give grand rounds to clinicians, other like clinics in the area that were interested in it. So it started like increasing the visibility around like the legitimacy of it. Like we're doing an approved clinical trial. Clinicians are showing interest. They're curious about continuing education. And then Compass selected us as a site for their phase 3 depression trial. So now there's that's been running at the university, as well as I think another clinic in the area has been approved as a site. And then there's talks of more kind of studies happening. So I think it's been helping kind of across the board to kind of get things going, while also helping to like get more people just talking about it in the community and like normalizing the conversation, so it doesn't feel so fringe or risky to just talk about it or take an interest.
It's definitely breaking down the stigma is like the hardest part, I think, of getting the trials, getting people interested and being willing to talk about it, because for so long and there's been such a negative light on psychedelics and all the bad stuff has been highlighted. And so I think, building this community, and also, like you said, as scientists, we are able to show the legitimacy of it through the medical or the research process, which is not the only process, but is one that, you mentioned in the eyes of the law, that's kind of the one that they value the most.
Well, and I think also, I think we saw like the public perception of like cannabis really shift over the years. The more medical programs popped up, not because an FDA approved clinical trial like made marijuana legal or cannabis legal in any capacity. It's really because these state programs were popping up and people started to feel more comfortable, like, oh, maybe it's not this bad thing that the government has been telling me all these years. Like there seems to be uses, people are getting benefit. And I think we're seeing a similar thing with psychedelics, where the more that people talk about the mental health benefits and other things, that the skeptics are able to see like, oh, this isn't just a drug, right? This might be medicine. And I think that changes the narrative, while also recognizing that that's not the only way that people can or want to engage with psychedelics, and really being flexible, but not trying to cut off options, but also not restricting it to being just only medical or only religious or whatever.
Yeah, and I have a question about that I'm going to save, because I want to ask a little bit more about the task force and the recommendations that were made in the report that you mentioned in January. My first question is, what was it like being in the room with all of those different perspectives when you guys are working through this 14-month process?
Yeah, it was interesting. So we never actually convened in a physical space. It was all done over Teams, I think, or like Zoom. So that was one bit where it kind of felt a little disconnected, but at the same time, yeah, we're still like gathering together, talking about stuff. Initially I'll say, and I'm just speaking for myself and not necessarily as like the chair of the task force, but initially it felt a little interesting, like there was some kind of like adversarial relationship between the state appointed people and the public, right? So it's like everyone that was like publicly appointed, the people that volunteered, submitted applications to do this, really were like, we want this available, we want to do whatever we can to get some kind of access program started. Whereas everyone that like works for the state, representative of these state agencies, were just very skeptical. They really didn't want to dig into too much or say too much on the record, it felt like, and just, doing their job, because they weren't necessarily there as themselves. They were there representing their entire agency. So they were really limited in what they could say, what kind of information they could disclose. But in like private conversations, people were like, well, I also volunteered for this because I'm curious about this and I think it could help, but we need to make sure we're doing it the right way. Like Minnesota is pretty risk averse. And they're fine, I think, as a state pushing boundaries and doing things, but they don't want to be the first on something that's too radical, So I think it was just interesting to try to toe that line. But then I feel like over the course of all of our meetings, like I saw a lot of minds change and become a lot more open-minded and amenable to things. And that was really encouraging that we brought in a lot of subject matter experts that I think helped change people's minds around like, what's the reality of this? And it's not just the propaganda of the war on drugs and everything we heard about, during the 1960s. Like there's a lot there. And I just think people were generally just not informed about what was actually going on and what all the data said and what the community said and what the history of it was. So I think that went a long way. By the end of it, they all felt like pretty close. And I feel like I've developed good relationships with all of them. And so it was an interesting process and an interesting evolution to kind of see the dynamic shift and figure out like what's possible and where do we still need to do more outreach and education, and like where are people still kind of having some like rigid mindsets around access and safety.
Yeah, I love the education piece and the building community where you least expect it, right? It's pretty fun.
Yeah, like unlikely bedfellows.
So you mentioned that there was a report that you guys made with just some concerns, some like what's currently happening, what the literature says, and then there's some major recommendations in there. Can you discuss the recommendations that were made by the task force?
Yeah, so we had like a democratic process of how we were going to say what are our official recommendations to the legislature by voting through a supermajority vote on, what would be like official recommendations. But we were consistently told by the legislative members of the task force that these reports aren't like legally binding for the legislature. So they're like, we'll take them into consideration, but ultimately we'll do what we want with this information. So they're really just kind of suggestions, but having like a supermajority vote for a recommendation does carry a lot of weight. So the four basic like general topics that we talked about and covered in the report were decriminalization, a clinical program, funding for more research, and then an adult regulated use program. And that one, the last one, like wasn't necessarily like a viable option, but it was like, if we're talking about and being comprehensive of all the ways that you can and could and maybe should access psychedelics, what are the best ways to do that keep us safe, compliant with federal law, and help advance kind of anything that's beneficial about them, while making sure that we're like not just fully giving everyone access without any kind of like controls over that in terms of public safety. So we had 3 official recommendations that passed a supermajority vote of those. So the way the report is set up is that there's the recommendation section that kind of covers those 4 broad baskets that I talked about, with only 3 being actually approved. Because even within each section of recommendations, so for the decriminalization, there was actually 3 sub recommendations and only one of them passed. So one of them was, just providing access and decriminalizing like all of them. So the task force was asked to specifically focus on LSD, MDMA, and psilocybin. And so the fact that MDMA and LSD are synthetic was really making people uncomfortable in terms of like, how do we even source that within the state without violating federal law? Whereas mushrooms were a little bit more permissible because it's like, oh, just like cannabis, we can source it in the state. We're not violating any kind of like interstate commerce laws that might be involved when you're talking about like precursors to manufacturing synthetic drugs. So that recommendation had like a 50% vote. We needed a supermajority, which was 2/3. So that one was actually the lowest vote that we had for all of our recommendations, was for just decriminalizing all of them, just kind of at a state level. The one that did pass with a supermajority was to allow just possession and use of psilocybin mushrooms. And then the other one was, it just barely didn't pass the supermajority, but it was a simple majority to allow for cultivation as well as possession of psilocybin mushrooms. So that was the kind of decrim one. So then from that, we introduced a bill to enact that one, to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms only. The second recommendation was for a clinical program. And so again, there was kind of a couple different sub recommendations within that. One would be a clinical program with all of the psychedelic medicines, which I think, again, all these things passed a simple majority, but I think the fact that we were kind of concerned around, or there was concern from like state agencies and others around how do you source MDMA and LSD outside of the pharmaceutical industries using them in like federally legal clinical trials. So that one was kind of like, sure, it sounds great in theory, but where are we going to get it? Like, how can we have a state program without creating like bathtub labs, I think was the term that kept coming up that people were concerned about. So that one didn't pass, but a clinical program with just psilocybin mushrooms did. So that was encouraging. So that's kind of creating, kind of similar to Oregon and Colorado, but learning from their mistakes of like what's kind of too restrictive and how they're allowed to use them, where they can use them, where they can source them, things like that, who can be a facilitator. So we have a little bit less restrictions on that, but that one passed. And then the third recommendation, which was unanimous, was just allocating funding for more research and clinical trials into this. So that's kind of what we've seen coming out of Texas, where they're not like creating a program for state regulated access, they're creating a funding infrastructure so people can just do clinical trials under the current federal system of trying to create a supply and run a clinical trial. So those are the big ones. We did get a simple majority for the adult regulated use because there was a report that came out from the RAND Corporation while we were writing our report that was very comprehensive around like how to actually regulate psychedelics. And it seemed like the biggest takeaway from that was like, just regulate it like you would any other product. That's the safest way because you know what's in it. You don't have to get all these weird analogs that people are creating to get around the Controlled Substances Act. And you have an infrastructure in place to make sure that it's not being given to kids, it's not being done, and like people aren't driving around on it, so that, even though it sounds crazy, is the safest option. And, people were amenable to it, but I don't think we're there yet. And we definitely wouldn't want to be the first state to do that, but we talked about it. And there's a detailed plan for how to implement it in our report.
Yeah, awesome. And so I've linked on the banner if anyone else is interested about the task force or any of the recommendations. The full report is on the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota page, so you can go check that out there. Your guys' website is amazing, by the way. It had like every question I had I could find on there, so I wanted to shout that out.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a constantly evolving process. I used to have a section on there that was like trying to stay up to date on all the clinical trials back when it wasn't that many. And I'm like, I can't even keep up with it now. So I think now I just refer to psychedelic.support and they have like an interactive map that I think links to clinicaltrials.gov. So it's always current.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, and I know like Psychedelic Alpha has like their trackers for different stuff too going on. So yeah, there's lots of tools.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you mentioned about, having the adult access and how we kind of do have a layout for that across the US. We see it with alcohol and tobacco products. So I think it's always interesting when people try to use the argument of like, well, how can we keep it out of the hands of kids or, whoever we don't want to have it? I'm like, go to the corner store in your state, there's an example right there. So I think it'll be interesting to kind of see how that evolves with psychedelics and because we have the unregulated products in a lot of the smoke shops in Michigan right now because there is decriminalized in various locations. So just interesting to see what products are popping up and then are they actually containing what they say they're containing, and if we had a regulatory process to check that, it'd be a lot safer for people to use.
Yeah, especially with the crackdowns of like diamond shrooms where it's like, who knows what's in this stuff? And it's like trying to create these new versions of things just to get around the Controlled Substances Act when we don't know if they're safe for human consumption. right? That's the whole point of the
Yeah.
FDA. Whereas these other psychedelics, like there's a long history, like they're safe for consumption. I think even the FDA has recognized this in their like drug development pipeline. They're like, with the classic psychedelics that have a known history of use in humans in the community, you don't need to go through all these like safety steps. Like we know how these things work. And I think they're just now reserving that, like doing the pharmacokinetics and animal research with like the novel ones that people are trying to develop that don't make you trip or whatever. But we don't
Yeah,
know
I
how
remember.
respond, if they're toxic, are they causing weird signal in the brain, are they causing inflammatory issues, like who knows.
Yeah, I remember when like the NIH came out with their like recommendation for like people because people kept submitting all these studies and they partnered with like the FDA to be like, okay, you don't need to do all this. We know what psilocybin does. They're like, you can focus on other aspects. It's kind of interesting to see like these major agencies like being like, okay, it's fine.
Yeah, it
Um,
saves money and time.
what'd you say?
I was saying it saves money and time, like to not have to go through all those loops. It's like we already have the information, just use it. You just have to trust the gray literature and the community and kind of just public safety and toxicology reports and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I would want to get into a little bit of the other like decrim efforts happening. So you mentioned Minneapolis. I cannot. Okay, Minneapolis. Is that? I'm
Minneapolis, I
stumbling
think
here.
you're combining Indianapolis.
Okay, I'm putting an extra N in there somewhere for some reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, so decrim has happened there. Are there any other like decrim efforts in other cities right now? I know there's been some bills introduced by Representative Andy Smith in the state, so just curious about those.
You know, as far as I know, I haven't heard of anything other than I feel like I heard actually Rep Smith mention that Duluth had done something and maybe there was some efforts in Rochester, but if I Google it, I can't find anything. So I don't know. It's possible that it happened in Duluth and they just really kept it under the radar. There was a branch of the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota up there in Duluth. And, you know, I think individually they would say that the cops like just didn't care and they have a pretty thriving community up there because it's about like a 4-hour drive from Minneapolis. So they kind of have their own community up there. But I can't find anything about it online. So it's just kind of a rumor at this point. So as far as I know, it's just officially been Minneapolis and then the legislation introduced at the state level, which hopefully would just cover the whole state. But the state one is really only for psilocybin mushrooms and not for like all entheogens, whereas the Minneapolis one is really based on kind of the decrim nature model with a carve out excluding peyote.
Okay. Is that like to protect the peyote, like
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't
or-
grow in Minnesota, but it's just, you know, at the request of Native Americans and the Native American church to just please exclude that from all these things because it sends a message to the community that it's okay to try to go harvest these things. And most people that aren't part of the Native American church don't know how to properly harvest it and they'd kill an entire crop. So it's really just like honoring that wish from the Native American church.
yeah, I think that's great. Do you want to talk a little bit about the state level legislation for psilocybin? Is that the 2699, the House bill?
Yeah, so we have two separate bills introduced. I think we didn't
Okay.
want to have one big bill that incorporated both because I think when we've seen that, people are kind of confused. They're like, well, I'm supportive of this, but not this. So we wanted them to be separate. So HF 2699 is the decriminalization for psilocybin mushrooms bill. And then the other one, I think it's 2906, is for the state regulated psilocybin mushroom clinical program. And so those are both have been introduced, but they got introduced fairly late in the session. And we only have like a half session here in Minnesota. So it runs from like February to May. So it was introduced, it was assigned to a committee, but it's not going to move through because they had already like allocated like what the budget's going to go for. So there wasn't really any room to like really discuss it. And if they had tried to put it up for a vote, it probably would have failed because there wasn't enough education around it. Like we have this massive report, but whether someone's going to read a 200-page report, you know, I think I threw it into ChatGPT to get like a 1-page summary to hand to legislators to help, but really we want to focus on like educating the public, educating policymakers so that when it comes time to actually move through in 2026, there'll be enough of, you know, an informed decision around what it is that hopefully we can get a lot of bipartisan support and enough votes to move it through to get to the governor's desk at some point. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So do you we mentioned this, the medicalization aspects. I kind of want to circle back to that. And this bill for psilocybin, is that just, it's all possession or is it medical use? Sorry if I missed that.
So the decrim bill is just anyone over 21 can possess and use and cultivate. And then the clinical program is, it's not like you can only do it in a hospital, you can only do it with a psychiatrist. It's got a lot more flexibility. We tried to keep it fairly simple because ultimately the way that our legislature works is like they'll work out all the details for how to regulate it in committee. So we tried to keep it as kind of simple as possible and not hamper ourselves with too many restrictions unless the legislature decides that those things need to be put into place based on the report. So that would allow people to grow their own. Or designate a caregiver to grow it for themselves if they don't have the ability to do so. That would be regulated by the state. Having facilitators, if they wish to be licensed, to become approved by the state. And then people can choose who their facilitator is, but not making it so that facilitators can only be people with like a master's or a PhD or an MD, anyone that like has experience that goes through a training program and that the state deems is, capable of doing this.
Okay, cool. And like, yeah, I think that's interesting, the state approved program and everything, because I know there's been some issues with some of the psychedelic training programs in other states where only specific programs are recognized and people don't realize that. So they do a lot of random online training programs and then they go to practice or they go to register in Oregon or Colorado and then they're told no. Do you have any thoughts like on that process or how we could maybe streamline that a little better?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, having, a set of trainers and companies that have a good track record for churning out good psychedelic therapists and facilitators, and just maybe having an approved list of who those people are, and then saying, these are the people that, because I think this is what Colorado did. I don't know if it's the same in Oregon, where certain organizations had to apply to be like accredited so that their training program would be accepted for licensure in the state regulated program. So I imagine a similar thing where people just kind of need to do their homework and the government can do its job to kind of spread that information of like, who are the approved educational organizations that can get you this license that you need? Like what do we need from them? And then they can do that. And if they choose to go outside of that, they're taking that risk, but I think having more programs that aren't just restricted to mental health professionals, I think would also help. Because a lot of the programs really do require you to have like a clinical license of some kind to be in the program. Whereas
Like a master's or
like either like a master's in clinical counseling or, a PsyD or a PhD in clinical psychology or a psychiatrist or a nurse or something like that, where they have that clinical training, but those folks also don't actually get that formal training when they train to be a mental health therapist or a psychiatrist. Like physicians aren't trained in psychedelics at all, so recognizing that that's not the only way. It is one way, but those people aren't really taught that. Like everyone needs to go through these programs to understand best practices that are unique to facilitating psychedelic sessions that aren't really something that's in the toolkit of your average clinician, from my perspective. I've been through a couple of these training programs, and the clinicians that go through it like really have a lot of like unlearning that they have to do around how to approach people in vulnerable states and not being too pushy or directive or trying to invoke psychoanalysis while someone's tripping. Like I think a lot of that needs to be taken into consideration, whereas other people have been facilitating for decades and they're really good, but they don't have the, professional credentials that Western medicine wants to see.
Yeah, I remember I gave a talk in a class for a master's of social work class one time about psychedelic research and about, I think it was about MDMA for PTSD and I was talking about, the measures that they use and, different aspects of the research and then how that would look like in a clinic and half of the people in the like class never even heard of MDMA research or they weren't familiar with any of the measures we specifically use for psychedelics and for research. And I just thought that was like a really big eye opener of that does not translate across fields. Like it's not taught in the average, just training. So
yeah, I mean, I'd like to see that more. I know the medical school here at the University of Minnesota, some of the teachers were interested in trying to creating like an elective that folks could take in medical school. It didn't quite take off, but I think we just need more of that where it's just kind of baked into some of these clinical training programs. If it's going to become a major aspect of mental health care and treatment options, that it needs to be more properly infused into these accredited Western medical programs. Like medical school, I think they cover it in one lecture, like once, and they just say that it's psychotomimetic, and that's the extent of it. And that's actually been thoroughly debunked. But
Yep.
like,
We don't use that term anymore.
yeah,
But yeah. Yeah. So I think this is a good time to ask this question. As psychedelic medicine gains traction, as research gains traction, and you mentioned in Minnesota, how Compass has now chosen a few sites in your guys' state. How do you think the use of, developing like psychedelic medicine boards within the state could be helpful or hurtful? Do you have any thoughts on those?
lots of thoughts. So, I mean, I think they could be good in the context of like, okay, like physicians, therapists, they understand, they can recognize when people are in crisis. They know how to use the existing tools to help treat that. And they can understand like biological safety, psychiatric safety, things like that. So I think it does have a place, and I don't want to cut that off, because some people really need that medical model to feel like they can trust, and to have trust in the experience is really what helps people really dig in and have a good experience that can be beneficial. So if they need the white coat for that, that's fine. And I think there should be an option for that. But I think restricting it to only that is where it becomes harmful, because to bake this into our existing healthcare system, I think is highly problematic, because our healthcare system isn't really designed for healthcare or treatment or wellness. It's really designed to make money. And that's unfortunate. So I think we need to really think about like access routes, and, giving people as many options as possible for access, and recognizing that a lot of people are harmed significantly by Western medicine and current medical practices, and the lack of, economic opportunity to be able to engage with healthcare in a way that doesn't bankrupt you. So, the way that it's currently being implemented through clinical trials and these kind of restrictive state regulated programs that want to keep it in the medical model, or the push to do that, I think really kind of keeps it inaccessible. And so, I think both can be helpful, but really I'm a proponent of being able to take your health into your own hands and make decisions for yourself, and not having some medical entity telling you what to do with your own body and mind. I can't hear you.
My bad. I think one of the biggest critiques I have of this trying to infuse into the current model systems that we have is I always hear the argument of, well, psychedelics shouldn't be put into like a pill to give to people, and like they should remain in their natural or their beginning state. And everyone should have the trip and everybody should do this. And that's why it doesn't fit in the medical model. But one of the things I always think about is like in the current model we have, and in the late stage capitalism that we live in, we don't have time. People don't have time to go on a journey to have a full psychedelic experience. They don't have childcare. They don't have the cost that it takes in the states that have it, available right now, thousands of dollars, when they could find someone who is well trained, has experience, sit with it themselves. And I don't think everyone should do that, but I think, like you said, we should have the choice. And that's one of my kind of thoughts of being able to make it into like a non-psychedelic, I guess, is that you kind of reduce some of those barriers if you can still harness like the power of the drug. So do you have any thoughts there on like what like
Thoughts on what specifically?
on like taking the psychedelic and potentially making it into something more accessible, but within the medical system? Like, do you think that would work, or do you think it would still have its own host of problems?
I mean, that's a big question that I don't know that we fully have the answer to. I mean, I have my hunches around Western medicine's, problem of getting people to just avoid feeling pain at all costs. And I think that's highly maladaptive. Like a lot of times the cure for the pain is in the pain, like sitting and feeling it. And I feel the same about psychedelic experiences. Like they're highly meaningful, highly contextual. That in and itself, I think, is the reason why they're so helpful for people. I mean, I think they're doing cool stuff to the brain that we're starting to figure out, but it's the content of the experience. So if you're taking that away, I think we're missing out on what these things are actually able to do and the potential that they have. I know my husband's in this psychedelic therapist training program that's a Groff program that's really a proponent of like high dose experiences, really trying to lean into like the difficulty and really don't avoid it. And I like Stan Groff has had really great success with like giving even people with schizophrenia high doses of LSD, but they required like inpatient care, lots and lots of care, repeated doses, and were able to kind of get out of some psychotic states, but they got a lot worse before they got better. And he would say that like, you know, a lot of the like rescue medications that clinical trials will have on plan, that if somebody's starting to have a bad trip, give them a benzo, give them an antipsychotic, give them something to abort the trip. But then you're basically freezing them in the experience of like something from their subconscious that came up that then doesn't give them the opportunity to resolve. So I think, yes, there is the opportunity for more people to access it. And if people are thinking it's just a purely neurological phenomenon and it helps promote neuroplasticity, and then they can not have such rigid thinking and they're able to change their behaviors better, that might be a thing. But I think it's going to be similar. I mean, SSRIs invoke neuroplasticity, exercise invokes neuroplasticity. Like there are ways to do this, but I think there's something unique about the actual experience of it that I don't think we can really strip away without people being able to like fully access everything that they're able to do. But that's just kind of my personal opinion, because it's also part of my own like spiritual practice of like, I don't think I would have been able to like believe in God without psychedelics. You know, like I've had direct experiences and I don't think I could do that without the experience. And I think there's something profoundly healing in that. So ultimately people can choose how they want to do it. But, you know, I think our culture and Western medicine really is about like making things easy, quick, and having to do the least amount of work possible. But if you want something to be sustainable, if you really want to change in a meaningful way that's going to last, like there's a lot of work that goes into that. Like I know that we want quick fixes and drive through and things to be instant, but that just gives us little quick dopamine fixes. It doesn't actually change things like behaviorally or systemically. So that would be my argument, but that's also kind of a personal bias I have.
Yeah, no worries. I just like to see what people's thoughts are on that. And I mean with any work that you're doing, like, you know, internally, mentally, it's gonna be hard work. And I think a lot of people don't realize that with psychedelics, like you mentioned, because we want the pill, we want the quick fix. And just like with anything else, even if you're not using psychedelics, it takes several sessions of therapy to like really start to get even on the surface level of what you might need to work on, you know. And so I think psychedelics can be a really great catalyst for that. And I think that time will tell um, with everything like that. But yeah, I appreciate hearing your personal thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Scrolling, making sure I'm asking what I want to ask, and if I didn't miss anything, because we have about 15 minutes left. So kind of getting back to the tangible, right, and the work that is happening. And I'm kind of wondering, in your opinion, do you see some benefit to, you know, grassroots organizations leading these types of legislations or these models versus, you know, a medicine board or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think community gives the sense of like, this is what's actually happening in the real world versus like, what are they doing in a clinical trial? So I think having grassroots organizations helps kind of, because they're the ones that have the energy and the motivation and the desire to really be strong advocates for this. But it's also not totally sustainable because a lot of the community organizations, including ours, just don't have enough funding to really be lobbying. And as a 501c3, we can't lobby too much for political stuff. I'm trying to remember what the other part of your question was. Like, oh, the psychedelic medicine boards. I mean, I think they're useful to kind of help bring in multiple perspectives, because I think community aspect is one, to get like the public talking about it, to get people to understand like, how does this work in the wild? And is it safe or not? I think the fact that community organizations and community groups are showing like, we're not dying, we're not going crazy, we're not being hospitalized, like we're not getting arrested mostly. So, you know, it seems like that's the way to kind of normalize the conversation and get more people talking about it so that it feels safe and accessible. But that doesn't always convince a regulatory agency. Like they like to see people with credentials and track records that are already vetted, you know, like having an MD or a PhD or being a DEA license holder, things like that. So I think just having both of those conversations is really effective. But also, what I've seen change people's minds the most is like personal stories, which I do think come from community or patient advocates, where you can throw all the stats you want at a lawmaker, but unless you like make it personal and try to like tug at their emotional heartstrings, they're not really going to understand it or comprehend it in a way that's really effective. So I think you need the stats to kind of show like, well, objectively, these are the safety things, these are the risks, these are the benefits, and also listen to all these people telling you about their healing process or witnessing their son come back from the brink, things like that, that really, really, really motivate and inspire people to give this a serious consideration.
Yeah, do you think that the movements on all these various states, like through the grassroots organizations and through community, do you think that will hopefully inspire the federal government to make some moves, especially with kind of what's been going on with science and with the current administration? Do you have any opinions there on what we can kind of do to move the needle federally?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big question because
I know.
I used to do stem or spinal cord injury research, and back in the early 2000s, like the Bush administration was cracking down on stem cell research, and so I feel like the government's always just trying to impede science and research and restricting funding, and I don't know how that would change other than changing certain things federally through Congress. Like, I think in order for things to be more accessible, I don't think all the narrative from, I mean, even with cannabis, like we see so much support for cannabis, and yet they still won't change the laws federally around it, even though so many people are advocating for it, community organizations, um, state programs, things like that. So I don't necessarily think that that's going to get us there. I think what we need is to amend the Controlled Substances Act through Congress, and it needs to be a truly evidence-based system, which it currently is not, as we saw with the recent DOI hearing that you were involved with. Like they don't see evidence. Like, I don't know what they need to change their mind, and I think ultimately it needs to be a systemic thing for it to
I
change at the federal
fully
level.
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of just I don't even know a good word, bewildering. I don't know. It's wild to see the like rules that they use to like decide what becomes scheduled and how outdated it was compared to modern research. And when
Right.
we tried to bring that up, it was basically just we like kept getting questions from their like lawyers of, well, is that the criteria? And we're like, no, but we're trying to tell you that the criteria doesn't even make sense in 2025. Like, when was this made? Like 1970? You guys need to update. Like,
Well, and the fact
so
that they're trying to do a scheduling based on stuff they saw on Reddit, and that's their documentation of evidence of use, while not taking that same type of evidence to document safety and effectiveness in other areas. Like, to me, that's the better data. And it's like, if you're going to use one to schedule, you need to also accept that that's evidence to reschedule, right? Or not schedule. And so that just feels a little
yeah,
hypocritical. It's just like, what is it that you are considering evidence? And what is your evidence-based decision making? Because it doesn't seem consistent. Like, what you need to put it on Schedule 1 is really, really insufficient. And then what you need to take it off Schedule 1 is just so ridiculous that I don't think it does. It seems like a black hole, like a regulatory black hole that nothing can get out of, no matter how much science you throw at it.
it's like a big circle of like DEA, HHS, FDA. It just goes around and around, and there's no like outside person to be like, hey, this doesn't make any sense. And to get at the Reddit posting, just real quick, and then we'll
Yeah.
wrap up. But you got me talking about it, so but the Reddit post was wild because the comment that they like referred to as like their big like gotcha moment was a comment on an article talking about like a therapeutic effect of psychedelics
Mm.
that somebody had posted on Reddit. So it's just mind blowing to me that you're going to ignore that whole part and then you're going to go 18 comments down and pick out the one that you wanted that was clearly like a shit post.
Yeah.
Like it was just mind blowing to me.
That's why I think they need some sort of overarching policy that comes through Congress to like clarify how are you actually making scheduling decisions. I mean, that just needs to be reformed, full stop.
Yeah, for sure. All right, we have about a few minutes left. So before we wrap up, I just want to ask you what is next for, your personal or your organizational advocacy work, what you got going on.
Yeah, right now, so I was on the tenure track at the University of Minnesota trying to do psychedelic research. I burnt out pretty hard because it was very challenging. I couldn't get it funded. So I decided to step away from that. So I'm now just an adjunct and don't receive salary, but been really trying to beef up the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota because as a 501c3, I could be doing clinical trials and research through that. So I'm really trying to get us set up so that like I need to apply for what's called federal wide assurance so I can be eligible, so we can be eligible to apply for federal funding. Um, and I was able to negotiate getting a Young Investigator Award that I got from Hefter to fund the psilocybin trial at the U. But now they won't let me use that money now that I'm adjunct. So I'm negotiating getting that transferred to the Psychedelic Society, which will give us some money to like get the ball rolling on taking in grants, applying for new grants, and being like a proper research organization, and really trying to focus more on community-based research and helping with community advocacy, advocating at the legislature at the Capitol to try to get some of these bills pushed forward. And I've also been recently, given my work on the task force, and I was accepted into this boot camp at Harvard Law School last year as like a psychedelic boot camp, where part of it was like learning about the basics of the law. We had to get like a 0L certification. So the way that law school's set up, it's like 1L for year one law school, 2L, 3L. So 0L is like pre-law, but it kind of gives you a crash course in like all of it. And I was so fascinated. Like I haven't been so interested in something since I started learning about the brain or started like learning more about psychedelics. And so the passion to me was like really indicative of like, oh, the law seems to be where a lot of this stuff needs to happen, and having a really good understanding of how our legal system works and how bills get passed seemed really important. So I'm studying for the LSAT right now and trying to decide whether I want to also be a lawyer to be able to do some of that. I mean, because ultimately I feel like I said, like one of my big long-term goals is to amend the Controlled Substances Act. And I'm not sure if I can do that as a lawyer, as a scientist. Should I run for office? I don't know. But ultimately, I'm just trying to get more money for our local organization to be able to do more research and to be able to get things changed here while thinking about like, what does that mean nationally? So that's been my main focus recently, is really just trying to like pivot us from like a community organization to like a full-on like proper research organization that can be fully funded and do clinical trials.
Awesome. I too have thought about being a lawyer after I got more involved in the policy stuff. It's just so like the adrenaline that I felt in the DEA stuff was just like unmatched to anything that I felt before. So
Yeah,
I
the
feel
way
like
that they ask questions, and you're just like, I think it's good to like, I mean, because that's part of it, I think, is they teach you how to like calm yourself and to just sift through like, what is the actual information here that I need to be responding to, and not responding to the stuff that's trying to get me upset, you know?
yeah, exactly. Um, and then just another question about, we've talked a lot about stigma and how the community efforts are helping to reduce that. So do you have anything that you'd say to like parents or families or individuals who might be against or still on the fence about use to crim or legalization of psychedelics?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, I think in general, I always tell people like, look at the science and the culture and the history around this. Like, don't believe all the propaganda that the DEA is putting out or that law enforcement is putting out, because that's not based on evidence or wellness or anything. It's more based on control. I don't know that that's the message I would give to a parent, but just sort of being a little bit open-minded about like, other cultures have used this for thousands of years. They don't always give it to their kids, but some do as like a rite of passage. Ultimately, I think that's a conversation for parents and their children. Like they have to have similar conversations about alcohol and how and when to engage with that. So, I would just say like fact-checked information, do your own research, really try to stay up to date on what the science is saying, what the culture is saying, and be mindful of kind of the old school drug war propaganda that's really trying, and big pharma propaganda that's really trying to keep these things out of the hands of people that could benefit from them. But also recognizing that like it's a scary subject for parents, and there are organizations that exist that kind of try to promote this. Like I think there's Planned Parenthood is one of them, where it's like a play on the word Planned Parenthood, but it's Plant Parenthood. And it's really about like parents who use psychedelics. So how do they talk to their kids about it? And just really trying to understand that, these things are pretty physically safe. They just have some kind of psychological issues that need to be factored in, and whether folks want to talk about with their kids is a very personal decision. But I'd say the science on it suggests that it's fairly safe when done in the right context, but do your research.
I think education is always a huge part of that. Harm reduction education is like, psychedelics are great, but they can also be not great. It just depends completely on, mode and mind and all of that. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, and then the last thing I want to ask you is just, aside from yourself and your organization, do you have some other leaders or innovators or advocates in your community that you want to shout out?
Yeah. So our another local organization called Big Psych. They're a community organization that really focus on like psychedelics for everyday people, not doing it within this medical or scientific arena, and really just building community around psychedelics and mushroom cultivation and responsible, safe use. And it's a pretty diverse community, and they've been working with some of the tribes in Minnesota to help them get educated on mushroom cultivation and best practices to determine if they want to change their laws around that to have programs on their lands. So that's one of the good organizations that we have here. There's another organization called Waking Nomad, which is kind of like a spiritually based community. They do a lot of cool things like sound baths and things that kind of help you settle into like big expansive experiences while not giving people psychedelics, but just really kind of preparing people for how to navigate these really embodied type experiences. So those are the two kind of local organizations that we partner with a lot, that we have a lot of shared goals and events that we do together. And they've just been really leading the effort and keeping the community together and keeping people engaged with like wellness practices and fun events, where our organization has been mostly focused on the policy stuff as of late and haven't been doing, fun events and parties and stuff. So they're really I think the heart and soul of the psychedelic community in Minnesota, where we're more of like the trying to get shit done.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing those. And is there anything else you want to add before we close out today that we didn't talk about?
Oh, I don't know. Just stay responsible, stay educated, and keep an open mind about the evolving landscape, and try to talk to a skeptic at least once a week, and slowly change people's minds one conversation at a time.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. It's a pleasure talking to you. I had a great time. I hope you did too. And for those who might have missed this live stream or want to, rewatch it, it's going to be on YouTube, on the Psychedelics Today YouTube, and you can also read more about the legislation that's happening in an upcoming article through Lucid News. Thank you to our partners. Thank you to Psychedelic States of America. And thank you to Jessica. Have a good one.
Thanks. Bye.